And I will record the video since you all like me to do that. So, muscle system. Page 301 in the paper copy. If you're looking electronically, we're on page 114, just starting chapter 9. The only function of the muscle system is to generate force. That is literally the only function it has. Now, most people would say movement. Well, that's why you generate the force. Does everybody see this? You generate force for the purpose of movement. But the only thing the muscles actually do themselves is generate the force. Sounds like a line from a bad Star Wars movie. We've had plenty of those lately. So anybody caught up? We know where we are. On that page, there are several vocabulary terms. I want to make sure that you remember to be studying those. You will see them on your next exam. And just to reiterate, there are three types of muscles: skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. We're going to focus most of all on the skeletal muscle because generally those are the ones that generate the most force. They're the ones we have control over, and we can move them how we want to. Smooth muscle is generally going to be found in small quantities, and by that, you're not going to have a dense, smooth muscle like you have in your biceps or your lats or anything like that. So everybody understand that? The key there is that the smooth muscle generates a low amount of force, but it's often additive, meaning you'll have multiple layers. If you look in the digestive system, say the stomach, you've actually got 3 different layers of smooth muscle. You got some that squeeze it like this, you've got some that compress it like this, and you've actually got some oblique muscles that twist. So your smooth muscle is going to be found in a lot of your internal systems, helping to regulate them and move things through them. Blood vessels, the digestive system, the lymphatic system, basically anything internal that does not have an external force. Everybody okay with that? And of course, cardiac muscle, the only place you're going to find that is in the heart. So the structure of a skeletal muscle. You have over 600 muscles in your body. Bet you didn't realize there's that many, did you? Kylie's nodding because she's had to study for that quiz today. Yeah, there are a lot of them. But the skeletal muscles are all organized in the same way. It's just a matter of scale. Is everybody clear on that? The base is going to be what we call a muscle fiber. A muscle fiber. And these are just simply tubular cells, long and thin. And one of the more interesting things is these are multinucleate. These are multinucleate. Why is that? transcriptional efficiency. Transcriptional efficiency. Since the muscles require a lot of protein, they need to be able to express their genes efficiently and rapidly. Imagine that I gave you an assignment to build a birdhouse, but you have to use my copy of the plans and only my copy, and I put it on reserve over in the Learning Center. A lot of you are going to be fighting to get access to that, aren't you? Because there's multiple versions of you and only one version of the plans. Everybody see how that would work? It took you 5 minutes to go there to get it off the shelf, make a photocopy, and put it back. By the time we add up the 15 or 20 students in here, that's going to take most of the class period, wouldn't it? Wouldn't it be far more efficient if I had 20 versions of it on file over there? If so, it could be a lot quicker. Does everybody see how this works? Okay. You'll also find that these are chock full of mitochondria. Dude, if you're going to cruise your phone, at least don't do it right 6 feet in front of you. If I'm that boring and you don't want to pay attention, don't be so blatant about it. At least have enough respect to do this. Back when cell phones first came out, we had fun with that. This one particular young man in my early morning class would always try to get away with texting. And I would always catch him. Finally, one day he says, "How do you know when I'm texting?" I said, "You're always sitting like this. I know you're probably not praying because you don't seem to be that kind of person. Whatever else you got going on down there, it can't be that interesting, so it has to be texting." Okay, so back to it. They have lots of mitochondria, because they need energy, ATP. Each of these fibers has some associated connective tissue. The connective tissue holds it together, obviously. It also is a location for the nerves and the blood vessels. The nerves and the blood vessels. The muscles are highly innervated, I-N-N-E-R-V-A-T-E-D. Innervation just means it has nerves through it. It's not quite as dense as you get in the skin, but it's still there. It also is highly vascularized. Vascularized means that it has lots of blood vessels. When you think about how much energy these cells use, you can see why they have so much blood supply. Is everybody cool with that? So let's take a look at how they're organized together. You've got something called the endomysium. The endomysium. This is the connective tissue that surrounds each muscle fiber. This allows for an exchange of ions, nervous stimulation. A bundle of muscle fibers together is called a fascicle. A fascicle. Essentially, they make up a single unit. They are in turn covered by another layer of connective tissue called the perimysium. The perimysium. And then in turn, the fascicles are bundled together into what we call a muscle. And that muscle itself is surrounded by a layer of fibrous connective tissue called the epimysium or epimysium. Everybody see that? We're on page 303, moving into page 304. A very good diagram of this would be figure 9.2. on that same page. Below the cellular level, this is internal to the cell, you've got what we call myofibrils. Myofibrils. These are overlapping parallel groups of filaments. Overlapping parallel groups of filaments. When you look at the muscle cells under a microscope, you remember those striations or bands that we saw? That is because of the myofibrils. Their pattern establishes the striations. And then those in turn are made up of two types of fibers called thick filaments and thin filaments. Thick and thin. And those, in turn, are made up of actin and myosin. Actin and myosin. Actin and myosin are the two proteins that are responsible for muscle movement. If you want to see a summary of this, check out table 9.1 on page 304. Everybody see that? Okay, so the myofibrils are essentially the contractile unit. They are essentially the contractile unit. And these are extremely specialized. The sarcolemma is the cell membrane, S-A-R-C-O-L-E-M-M-A. And the cytoplasm is called the sarcoplasm. And basically, it's just chock full of nuclei and mitochondria. That's about the only thing you'll really find in a muscle fiber. The myofibrils make up the bulk of the cell. They fill it pretty much full. The thick filaments are made up primarily of myosin, M-Y-O-S-I-N. The thin filaments are primarily the protein actin. And this is what gives you those alternating light and dark bands that you see. These are called sarcomeres, S-A-R-C-O-M-E-R-E. The sarcomere are essentially the subunit of the myofibrils. The myofibril is just sarcomere after sarcomere after sarcomere, end to end to end. The light part are called I bands. These are the thin actin filaments. The darker part is called the A band. And those are the thick filaments, the myosin. These are held together by a protein called titin, T-I-T-I-N, or connectin. Titin or connectin. Either one is correct. And these connection points are called Z-lines. The thick filament, if you take a look at figure 9.5, you'll see how this is organized. And you may want to take a closer look at that just to make sure that you're seeing what you need to see. And don't start yawning or you'll get me yawning too, and that's not good for anybody. I know I'm not at my most dynamic, but I'm trying. So does everybody see that? Everybody on that page? These myosin heads stick out, and what they are going to do is interact with the thin filament. The thin filament has the actin. It also has two regulatory proteins on it: troponin and tropomyosin. Troponin and tropomyosin. Tropomyosin is held in place by a troponin molecule, and these are what allow the fibers to contract. The remaining thing you need to be aware of, in the sarcoplasm, you've got a network of channels that's very similar to the endoplasmic reticulum. You all remember that? This is called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The sarcoplasmic reticulum. And it basically has the same function as the smooth ER. Everybody with me? Haven't put you under the table yet? I'm trying my best. Jace looks halfway there. I know this is not the most interesting. It's just a veritable list of components. But make sure that you follow along and get note of it, because you'll have to know how all this fits together. So, muscle contraction. The nerves connect to the muscle cells at what we call a neuromuscular junction. A neuromuscular junction. And here's an interesting thing that you may not be aware of. Nerve cells are not actually physically connected to each other. They actually have a long, thin process that extends out that is called the axon, A-X-O-N. At the end of the axon, there is a little gap between that nerve and its target. That gap is called a synapse, S-Y-N-A-P-S-E. The synapse gets bridged by chemicals called neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters. If those neurotransmitters don't jump the gap and land on the target, then the nerve impulse no longer gets conducted, or if it's a neuromuscular junction, the muscle ceases to contract. Has anybody here ever heard of fugu? Fugu is a form of sushi that is made from the pufferfish. Y'all ever heard of that? Pufferfish looks small, but it can literally blow itself up, and it's got spikes all over it. It's a defensive mechanism. It also has a toxic substance called tetrodotoxin in it. And if you make sushi from this and you are not trained properly in the preparation of it, then whoever consumes that sushi will die, because there is no antidote. The tetrodotoxin prevents the neurotransmitters from functioning. Let's see how many people they have a year die from this. typically estimated at a few dozen worldwide. 20 to 40 annually in Japan, where it's considered a delicacy. So that's how nerve agents work. You ever heard of nerve gas? Chemical weapons? That's how they work. They paralyze the neuromuscular junction. So once the transmitters bind to the muscle cell, what happens next? This stimulates contraction. The neurotransmitter is called acetylcholine. Once the acetylcholine binds to the muscle cell, it excites it. When the cell is at rest, it has a high concentration of calcium ions in it. These are stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum and released into the cytosol. They are released into the cytosol, the cytoplasm, if you will. This in turn causes the myosin heads to bind to the actin on the thin fibrils. Troponin and tropomyosin keep the heads of the myosin from binding when it's at rest, but once the calcium channels are open, those troponin and tropomyosin complexes pull back, the heads now bind to the thin fiber. Everybody clear on that? The calcium actually changes the shape of the troponin. This causes the muscle to contract or get shorter. ATP is spent, the heads slam back, troponin blocks the binding of the heads, and it's reset and recocked for another contraction. Figure 9.8 on page 308 does a really, really good job of showing this. Table 9.2 also does a good job summarizing it. You have to have ATP for this to occur. Make sure you get that down. No ATP, no contraction. And proteins have our muscle cells have another protein called myoglobin, myoglobin. This is what gives it its reddish brown color. Anybody ever bought a frozen steak or meat at the deli or the grocery store and you thaw it out and you get a little bit of red juice in it? That's not blood. That's actually myoglobin that's broken down. It's normal. The myoglobin has a higher affinity for oxygen than hemoglobin. It actually will strip oxygen molecules from red blood cells. But you want it to do that because you want your muscles oxygenated. You have to have that. What this does is it allows the muscles to temporarily store oxygen. if you are doing a very intense workout involving your muscles, you will very quickly reach a state of oxygen deficit. But if you need a burst of activity and your breathing can't keep up, that's where the myoglobin comes in, and it has a ready supply of oxygen held in reserve for your muscles. If you keep doing an extended workout, eventually the oxygen deficit gets so big that your muscle cells will start undergoing fermentation rather than respiration, because they have to keep the ATP flowing. Everybody got that? We call this an oxygen debt, an oxygen debt. And once you reach oxygen debt, the efficiency of your muscles falls off. Whenever you exercise regularly, you're essentially training your muscles. You stimulate the formation of more capillaries and more mitochondria within the muscle fiber. The capillaries increase the blood flow, which increases the oxygen it's getting. All of this movement also generates heat. It generates heat. You ever shivered when you're cold? That is due to your smooth muscles contracting to keep your core temperature up. The core is this part here. Essentially the head, the torso, the abdomen. And that is where your most important organs are located. You have to keep the blood supply to the brain going. This is one of the reasons why people get frostbite, because when the core temperature gets low, the blood vessels in the extremities will actually constrict to the point where there is no blood going through them. That's your body's attempt to keep the blood supply and therefore the warmth in your core. It's also why certain diseases like meningitis can cause people to lose their fingers, toes, or even limbs, even though it is an infection of the membranes that surround the brain. Bottom line, this is also how your body keeps itself warm. Humans are warm-blooded. We use the heat generated by our muscles for warmth. It also circulates with the blood. In fact, most of the energy that is used by the body is lost as heat rather than movement. Heat is essentially a waste product. Any questions? If I let you go into the lab now, is that too early? Okay, we'll stop the lecture there.